Good evening, and thank you for joining us for our special coverage of the State of the Budget address by Maine's Governor Janet Mills. I'm Amanda Hill.
And I'm Brian Nucono. We're keeping a close eye on the House chamber, where the governor will be addressing members of Maine's legislature and discussing her proposal for the next 2 years.
What's significant this time around in her proposed $11.6 billion budget is how many cuts to funding this actually includes. So she says a major loss in federal revenue from leftover pandemic programs is to blame for much of that as she prepares for the next 2 years. Of course, it's drawn mixed review from both sides of the aisle. Democrats concerned about losing funding to things like child care worker stipends, and Republicans refusing to sign anything that increases taxes.
The governor has referenced what she calls a structural gap of more than $450 million. She's looking at taxes to get more money into the state, including a proposal for more taxes on cigarettes. She says we have the cheapest cigarettes in nearly every New England state and haven't raised our excise tax on them in decades. We want to go live now to those images from the State House.
Rise and greet him from the convention. Again, we would like to thank the Specialist Keegan Wyman of the Maine Army National Guard. Would he please rise and accept the hearty greetings of the convention? The chair would request that Governor Janet T. Mills to please step forward and address the joint convention.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, okay. Wow, that's great. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Madam President, thank you. Mr. Speaker, Madam Chief Justice, Mr. Attorney General, Madam Secretary of State, up there somewhere, Mr. Treasurer, Chief Sabatis, I believe, is here, Chief Nicholas, thank you for joining us, members of the Cabinet, including our newly confirmed Commissioner Joan Cohen, members of the 132nd Legislature, and esteemed guests. Tonight we gather for the time-honored tradition of a governor's address to you, the 186 public servants who collectively have been chosen to represent the interests of 1.4 million people of the state. We just broke that threshold, you know. You remember 1 year ago today, 1 year ago this week, we were actually starting to recover from several deadly storms that had devastated communities up and down the state. We responded with the largest investment in storm relief in state history to rebuild our working waterfronts, our critical infrastructure, and local businesses. That funding that you all authorized was significant, but it was merely a down payment on the rest of the work ahead to prepare for the violent storms of the future. So as the very first measure of this session, we've come together again to introduce LD1, a bill that directly responds to the interim recommendations of our Rebuilding Commission to prepare our homes and public infrastructure against future storms. And so I want to thank Hannah Pingree, Director of my Policy Office, and for spearheading this measure, and of course Bob Carey, our Superintendent of Insurance, for his contributions to this important legislation. I also want to thank President Daughtry, Senator Daughtry, Speaker Fecteau, Minority Leader Stewart, and House Minority Leader Falkingham for sponsoring this bill. LD1 is the next step in fortifying our state and our economy from the type of damage that we experienced a year ago and that we are bound to see again. This bill has no general fund impact, so send LD1 to my desk. I will sign it. We gather tonight during a period of transition as a new administration takes shape in Washington. The new president has issued a flurry of orders, and he promises others that could affect our biennial budget and the very way we do things in our state and other states. Just yesterday, the President directed a halt to nearly all federal loans, grants, and other financial assistance. Like many of you, I have serious questions about the extent and scope of this decision, about the impact on Maine people, Maine industries, schools, small businesses, the elderly, and our most vulnerable, and about his legal authority to issue such an edict. My administration is evaluating the effects of this order, but it's already clear that it's causing needless chaos and confusion that could turn into real and serious harm. I want to reaffirm for the people of Maine, though, as with any administration in Washington, if the President does something good for our state, I will support him. If he does something that would harm our state, I will firmly oppose him. Time will tell what paths the President and the new Congress choose. No matter what, I ask this legislature to join me in putting the people of Maine first. The people we serve, they think for themselves, they take care of their neighbors, and they stand together when things get tough, regardless of their differences, and so can we. The people of Maine expect us to get things done, regardless of what happens in Washington. Drawn from 16 counties across the state of Maine, you bring diverse views and backgrounds and beliefs to this Capitol to create positive change and make our state a better place. Each of the bills you'll debate this session is designed to change things for the better. But the most consequential and complex tool we have to affect the lives of Maine people is the state budget. And that's the bill I want to talk with you about tonight. For 6 years, I've introduced balanced budgets. And with your support, these budgets have sent historic amounts of money back to Maine schools, Maine communities, and Maine people to create the conditions for strong economic growth. Nearly 40% of state revenue goes right back to local schools and local governments, with the hope that those funds will relieve the burden on property taxes assessed at the local level, alleviating the burden of those taxes and investing wisely in the things that bring jobs, that expand our workforce, and that protect those in need will keep us on the path to more economic growth. Excuse me. Well, I'm proud to report to you that Maine's economic growth is outpacing the national average, including the rest of New England, and it's outpacing even large states like New York and California. In fact, over the past 6 years, in spite of the pandemic, Maine has experienced more economic growth than it did in the entire 14 years before I took office. Our state's credit ratings have been upgraded to the second highest possible rating after being downgraded during the previous gubernatorial administration. And that's a reflection of what the credit agencies themselves have called our strong fiscal governance. Maine's unemployment rate has remained below 4% for 3 years straight, one of the longest stretches ever. And it's been consistently below the national average. The number of people working in Maine is at an all-time high. The average salary of a Maine worker has increased by more than 25% from 2019 to 2023. Our budget stabilization fund is near its record high limit. In fact, this emergency fund has grown by nearly $720 million since I took office. Last year, more than 17,800 new businesses opened up in Maine. We're proud of that. And one person who's been pretty instrumental in bringing about Maine's remarkable economic growth is Commissioner Heather Johnson, author of our 10-year economic plan, Maine native with national credentials. Commissioner Johnson has championed innovative new businesses, she's promoted free community college, and she's fought for universal high-speed internet for all Maine people, another economic driver and a boon to our state. Now, to my dismay, Commissioner Johnson has announced that she'll be pursuing new opportunities come March. But I want to thank her for her 6 years of hard work making Maine a better place to live. Thank you, Heather. I'm proud of our economic accomplishments, but some folks might be thinking, well, so what? A strong GDP isn't making my groceries any cheaper. A big rainy day fund isn't helping me buy a house. A low unemployment rate isn't making a dent in my electric bill. Well, I hear you. The cost of living in Maine, as in much of America, is too high. The price of fuel, the cost of supplies, utilities, and labor have driven up expenses for families all across the country and have impacted the budgets of nearly every state. And so I welcome a robust discussion among Democrats, Republicans, and Independents during this legislative session, because I want everyone to benefit from the availability of good jobs, a good public education, and good health care in our state. Those are the things that allow every person to be their best selves. Well, not everyone is feeling it. Our economy is strong, and that strength is reflected in recent budget surpluses. Over the past 3 years, for instance, we've ended every fiscal year in the black. In 2022, our budget surplus was $562 million. In 2023, it was $141 million. In 2024, nearly $94 million. But last year, we could see that these state revenues were leveling off as federal stimulus funds faded and as the economy returned to normal following the pandemic. That was no surprise. Most other states across the country, including many in New England, are seeing revenues level off too. At the same time, programs that people widely support, like education, revenue sharing, free community college, school meals, they're all costing more. The price of goods, the cost of fuel, equipment, technology, and labor all impact our baseline budget for K-12 education, school meals, higher ed, corrections, public safety, and other services. These baseline expenses also generate some of the increases included in this proposed budget. Maintaining the state's share of K-12 education alone costs an additional $156 million over the biennium, over and above the more than $2.8 billion in the baseline budget. That's K-12 education. On top of that, we are required by constitutional amendment passed in 1995 to pay down the debt to the teachers' retirement fund. That alone costs an additional $30 million, bringing the total cost of that item alone to more than $470 million over the next 2 years. That's a debt we have to pay. Well, for some of the same reasons, operational costs for hospitals, nursing homes, doctors, and nurses are also increasing. And at the same time, people are catching up on medical procedures that were postponed during and after the pandemic. And because our economy has improved, the federal share of those medical costs, or FMAP, for the Medicaid program has gone down, meaning we have to cover the $63 million the federal government is taking away from us for this coming biennium alone. Well, higher operational costs and the leveling off of revenues have merged to produce a tougher than usual budget environment this year. We saw this coming, which is why I asked the legislature last year to reduce spending by amending certain programs and to set aside $107 million for this coming biennium. That didn't happen, and instead, Measures were supported by people from both parties, which added spending onto the budget. Lawmakers then sent more spending bills to my desk, which I did not sign, so they did not become law. And some folks, again, not just Democrats, even tried to advance a spending bill that would have added another $117 million. We stopped that too. Now, I say this not to wag a finger at anybody, but simply to acknowledge that regardless of whether you're a Democrat, an independent, a Republican, the urge to say yes to well-meaning measures, especially at the end of a long legislative session, is very strong. And it's difficult to say no to last-minute appeals and heavy lobbying. My friends, this time around, we simply cannot say yes. The time for hard conversations and tough decisions is here, starting with the supplemental budget. In the supplemental budget, I'm asking you to close a current gap in Maine care that jeopardizes our timely payments to hospitals and others. That gap is the result of four things: the federal government requiring us to keep people on Maine care during and after the pandemic, an uptick in medical procedures, healthcare services, as more people went back to the doctor after the pandemic. 3, an increase in the cost of those services because of inflation. And 4, the practice of cost reimbursement, which does not allow the state to control those costs, something we're trying to move away from. Any of those things on their own might not have been troublesome, but together they're very concerning. We will need to address this shortfall promptly and within existing resources. And so I'm proposing to use the additional revenue we have taken in from this current fiscal year to cover that gap. Maine patients and providers need you to approve the supplemental budget in a timely, bipartisan manner to fulfill our obligation to hospitals, nursing homes, and others. Their budgets and their patients cannot afford disruptions and delays. So I urge you all to please approve this funding. Now let's turn to the biennial budget, another place where some tough choices will be required. Look, to fund every program in current law, every bill already enacted, every program already authorized, that would cost a minimum of $11.67 billion over the next 2 years. $11.67 billion. Current law. That actually is very highly an underestimate because costs have actually grown since last October when that number was calculated. On the other hand, the state is expected to take in about $11.2 billion in revenue. I don't have to spell that out for you. That's a budget gap. Now, Maine is far from the only state facing such a gap. In fact, many states are red and blue states both. Colorado is looking at a shortfall of around $750 million next year. Washington State's facing a $10 to $12 billion budget gap. Nebraska, a Republican-led state, is facing a $432 million shortfall. Iowa, another Republican-led state, is looking at a $1.1 billion budget gap, one driven not by spending, but by tax cuts. The point is that budget constraints are not unique to blue states or to red states this year. Every state is facing fiscal challenges right now, and for a variety of reasons. I'm pleased to say that Maine is in better shape than many other states, but we have work to do to enact a balanced budget as required by the Maine Constitution, one that provides stability, one that protects public safety, one that preserves a basic social safety net, and one that promotes the continued growth of our economy. That work will be hard, but we've done it before. It's easy to forget that of 20 major money bills in the last 6 years, supplemental budgets, biennial budgets, highway fund budgets. 16 of those, 16 of 20, were enacted with bipartisan support. Across these various spending bills, members of the minority and the majority parties voted together to change the lives of Maine people. We enacted Medicaid expansion, as voters told us to do. We achieved 55% state funding for education for the first time in Maine history, putting funds directly into the classrooms to benefit Maine kids. We fully restored revenue sharing to 5% after it had been severely cut by the previous administration. We're sending a lot more money to towns and cities for fire and police protection and the like so that those costs won't all be passed on to the property taxpayers. We delivered $850 checks to Maine taxpayers, one of the strongest inflation relief programs in the nation. And later, another $450 in winter energy relief payments. We did that together. We expanded property tax relief to keep more money in the pockets of Maine taxpayers, Maine residents especially. And we became the second state in the nation to fund universal free meals in the public schools, erasing a divide that only stigmatized kids whose families have less. We delivered 2 years of free community college to recent high school grads, bringing higher ed within reach of more students and creating a direct pipeline for trained workers for employers. We expanded student debt relief to all graduates, not just those who attended Maine schools, encouraging them to work here in Maine. And that tax credit is now one of the strongest student debt relief programs in the country. We enacted housing tax credits that are spurring construction across the state, and we developed a nation-leading Housing First program to end chronic homelessness. And we invested hundreds of millions of dollars in rate reform to improve Maine care reimbursements for many healthcare providers and to base those increases on objective criteria, not just on who lobbies more effectively. So I'm grateful to you in this room, both Democrats and Republicans and independents, who contributed to these and other achievements. My budget proposes to maintain these core commitments to Maine people, providing affordable health care, fully funding education, protecting the public safety, sending money back to our towns and cities in order to reduce property taxes, and keeping the doors of opportunity open for all people. This isn't reckless spending, as I've heard some say. Rather, if we did not do these things, hospitals would see more uncompensated care, property taxes would go up, and tuition to higher eds would certainly rise. Stealing from Peter to pay Paul never works. I should know, they're both my brothers. Now let's talk about health care. I've long said that we can't have a healthy economy if we don't have healthy people. We all know it's pretty hard to hold down a job or pay attention to school, support a family if you're sick or taking care of someone who is. I'm proud that we've expanded access to health care to more than 100,000 people in Maine, as the voters told us to do. And that expansion group is funded 90% by the federal government. In recent years, you also expanded health care for children to children with incomes, families with incomes of up to 300% federal poverty level, recognizing that, as we all do, keeping children healthy promotes better outcomes later in life. Last year, there were about 133,000 kids were in Maine care. That's up from about 100,000 in 2019. Those are the children alone. At the same time, nearly 70,000 people have come off the Maine care rolls as a result of the unwinding required by the federal government. And just recently, nearly 65,000 people have enrolled in private health insurance through Maine's state-based marketplace, coverme.gov, under the Affordable Care Act, a larger enrollment than ever before. Protecting the health care of Maine people particularly our most vulnerable and those who cannot afford health insurance. It's important. And that's why in this budget, I'm proposing $122 million a year to stabilize the main care program over the biennium. Nearly 400,000 people, including children, the elderly, people with serious disabilities, pregnant women, veterans, are enrolled in main care. They should not have to choose between getting medical care and going hungry, or going without heat, or being evicted from their home because they've had a heart attack, or had a car accident, or had a cancer diagnosis. In this budget, we're also strengthening our children's behavioral health system, including fully funding a residential psychiatric treatment facility for youth, the first of its kind in Maine, so that kids aren't sent out of state in order to get care. I also propose more money for therapeutic foster care, along with a screening system to better identify children's behavioral health needs. We know that emergency rooms are not where a child's needs are best met. All these measures are at the heart of our recent settlement with the U.S. Department of Justice to improve children's behavioral health services. I read a story recently about a family whose son waited nearly a year for a treatment bed for severe behavioral health needs. His mom, Jessica, said, quote, "We don't have choices, and he's in constant distress. We need to figure this out," end quote. Jessica's right. With the legislature's support, we have invested more than $260 million in recent years to improve these services. With this budget, we can and will do better by children with severe behavioral health needs and their families. Just as healthcare is a central part of this budget, so too is education. Every child in Maine deserves a good education, regardless of their zip code and regardless of their family's assets. I know you agree. In 2021, with that goal in mind, we met the state's obligation to pay 55% of local education costs for the first time since the voters told us to do so in 2004. It took a long time, but we got there. My budget to keep us there. My budget includes an additional $156 million to continue this commitment, investing directly in our schools, teachers, staff, and students, and preventing the entire cost of public education from being passed on to the property taxpayers. Now, I know that sounds like a lot of money, and it is. Fully funding education is the largest cost driver in state government behind Medicaid. In 2019, the state paid nearly $1.1 billion towards the cost of K-12 education. Having achieved 55%, that total now stands at $1.5 billion per year. It's a fact of life. These costs keep going up, and we have an obligation to our children to pay them. In 2021, we also passed nation-leading legislation to ensure that no Maine child goes hungry during the school day. I'm now proposing another $6 million for a total of $126 million over the biennium to continue this popular program so that no child tries to learn on an empty stomach. Together, we also increased funding for career and technical education centers by more than $20 million over the last 5 years. All of you agree, I know, that's a good investment. And in 2022, we made 2 years of community college free for recent high school graduates impacted by the pandemic. We believed that not only would it allow students to pursue higher education debt-free, but that it would make ready a trained workforce where it was sorely needed in certain sectors of our economy, and that it has done and continues to do. In the 2 years since then, more than 17,000 students have enrolled in Maine Community College tuition free. Hundreds of those students then transferred to 4-year colleges and they contributed to the highest increase in enrollment in the University of Maine system in 3 years. Cameron Beers of Eddington, the young person who studied welding at the United Technology Center in Bangor. She then used the free community college program to enroll in welding classes at Eastern Maine Community College. After she graduates, Cameron intends to work full-time and take courses at the University of Maine as well. Cameron is a shining example of the success of this program. Over the past several years, we've funded that free community college program on a one-time basis to evaluate whether it's working. I think the answer clearly is yes, and the time has come to make free community college permanent for recent high school graduates. I like community colleges. I hope you'll support this investment in my budget. Importantly, the budget also includes $41 million for a 4% increase for all of our public higher eds in Maine, the University of Maine system, Maine community colleges, and the Maine Maritime Academy to cover basic operational costs. We have to make sure that a college education in Maine remains affordable, and we cannot ignore the economic contributions of all of our higher eds, including the world-renowned research going on at our R1 institution, the University of Maine. Thank you, President Farini-Mundi and Chancellor Malloy, for your leadership as well. Thank you. As I mentioned, together, we have made historic investments in education to boost our public schools and hopefully fight property tax increases. In 2022, we also made historic investments in municipal revenue sharing. Finally, we restored revenue sharing to 5% for the first time in 13 years. Sending more than $260 million last year alone to cities and towns across Maine. By contrast, in 2019, revenue sharing was only $74 million to our cities and towns. My budget includes a total of $561 million to maintain the statutorily required level of municipal revenue sharing. That's about $284 million a year going directly back to cities and towns in 2027. And that increase makes a big difference to our communities. As Auburn firefighter Michael Scott said a few years ago, quote, "Any additional revenue coming into the municipalities that doesn't come straight from property taxes always makes it a little bit easier for the municipalities to figure out their budgets," end quote. Now, with these large increases in funds coming from state government, I fervently hope that towns, cities, and schools will find better ways to share and coordinate services and personnel, regionalize programs, save money, and reduce the burden on our property taxpayers. Stabilizing property taxes is important, and we also have to bring down other costs related to home ownership. You passed, and I signed into law, expansions of tax relief programs like the Property Tax Fairness Credit, the Homestead Exemption, and the State Historic Rehabilitation Tax Credit to promote housing development. You also passed, and I signed into law, historic new tax relief programs like the Affordable Housing Tax Credit, sponsored by Speaker Fecteau. You even let Speaker Fecteau move into his own accessory dwelling unit, ADU, right off the House chamber. He's back. My budget maintains these significant programs, and it maintains funding for our Housing First program as well to end chronic homelessness. We expect funding applications for at least 4 Housing First properties to be awarded this spring as scheduled. I'm also proud to say that my budget dedicates $3 million in one-time funding for the very successful Mobile Home Park Preservation Fund that we created last year. That fund has already preserved housing and prevented eviction for hundreds of people across Maine. Zach Walker, who lives at Blueberry Fields Cooperative in Brunswick, which was recently purchased by the residents, says he's been, quote, basking in the security that we'll never have to worry about what's going to happen in the future, end quote. These folks can now stay in their homes, continue to pay rent, keep their jobs in the community. It's money well spent. The budget also invests in public safety. After the tragedy of October 25th in Lewiston, we established a commission of distinguished experts, as you know, to determine the facts surrounding that horrific event. Following their report, we authorized an independent after-action review of the law enforcement response as well. That review recommended measures to improve communications and coordination in the event of another such tragedy. We are requesting in the budget some additional positions to meet those recommendations and to strengthen our response to future emergencies. As an aside, the Lewiston Commission also noted that Maine's extreme risk protection law, so-called yellow flag law, could have been used to remove the perpetrator's guns before that tragedy occurred. And last year, we strengthened that law to clarify and streamline the process further. Last week, advocates submitted signatures to force a referendum that would directly undermine our current law. Opponents of the current law argue that family members should be allowed to petition the court for removal of a weapon, not just law enforcement, that a mental health assessment is not necessary, and that maybe it stigmatizes people with mental health issues. Well, I agree that all people with mental health issues are not violent, and our law does not require a diagnosis or lengthy exam. It simply asks a medical provider to understand a person's frame of mind and determine whether that person poses a threat to themselves or others. Now think about this. The words suicide or suicidal were used more than 300 times by law enforcement to describe the state of mind of the individuals whose weapons have been removed by court order in recent months. This law is not a burden. These are folks who are in crisis, and now, thanks to the mental health assessment, they are now being connected, perhaps for the first time, to Maine's mental health system. The law provides due process, and it will survive legal scrutiny. And I don't believe a private citizen should have to navigate what can be a complex and confusing court procedure by themselves, especially when they're in the middle of already difficult circumstances. I believe it's the government's responsibility, not that of a private citizen, to protect the public from gun violence. Right now, law enforcement officers across Maine are taking this law seriously. They've been trained. They're using the law on a daily basis to remove firearms from those who should not have them. 672 times as of yesterday. As York County Sheriff William King put it, quote, "People are getting used to it. Spurwink put out a step-by-step process that's awesome for us and very clear about what to do and when to do it. It's becoming easier for us to implement the law," end quote. I stand by our current law, which was passed with a near unanimous support of the legislature. It's working. It's saving lives every day. Another problem that continues to threaten our health and public safety is substance use disorder. With your support, my administration, with the leadership of Gordon Smith, has partnered with people across the state of Maine to increase prevention, treatment, and recovery. We have widely distributed the overdose prevention, reversal drug naloxone. We have strengthened prevention in our communities and our schools. We've increased the number of treatment beds all across Maine. And at the same time, law enforcement is doing its job. They've taken nearly 200 pounds of illegal drugs off the streets last year alone, nearly 40 pounds of methamphetamines, and 35 pounds of fentanyl. Pounds, ladies and gentlemen. The problem remains. But Maine saw a 16% decline in fatal overdoses in 2023, one of the nation's largest decreases. And last year, overdose deaths declined by another 19%, 116 lives saved. We are saving lives, and we won't rest until this problem is solved. The legislature last year approved my request for $4 million to expand medication-assisted treatment in our county jails. And those funds are giving residents a chance at new life as they re-enter their community. One young woman named Amanda, who got MAT while she was at the Somerset County Jail, said, quote, "I felt like I was living, not just an addict. It made me feel like a regular person," end quote. So let's keep that program going with a continued funding for MAT in my budget. The budget also includes $1.5 million to continue our mobile crisis response teams, specially trained behavioral health responders dispatched 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to de-escalate mental health and substance use crises, to assess needs, and to provide an appropriate level of care in the least restrictive setting. Last year, we also authorized more crisis receiving centers, modeled on the successful center in Portland, to offer prompt and appropriate care for any person experiencing a mental health crisis, instead of that person suffering alone or languishing in an emergency department or in a jail, which happens all too often. We aren't able to fund all of the centers that were authorized or requested, but my budget does fund 2 new crisis receiving centers in Lewiston and in Penobscot County. So when taken with the one in Portland, these will provide improved geographical balance and better access to crucial services for more people. Now, it's worth noting here there are some things you're going to be asked about for which we're not proposing major increases. The budget of the Maine Commission on Public Defense Services, for instance, has quadrupled already from $11 million to $44 million in recent years. And next fiscal year, it will be more than $50 million. And yet, though we have poured more tax dollars, more and more tax dollars into this agency, more and more people than ever are going without legal counsel when facing criminal charges or child protection proceedings. The number of criminal defendants who lacked representation reportedly skyrocketed by 658% in 1 year alone between 2022 and 2023. That doesn't make sense when there are about 4,000 lawyers practicing in Maine, that only 130, according to the report, are rostered to take new cases. Many individuals are facing domestic violence charges, and the criminal defense bar is asking that these unrepresented and potentially violent people just go free. Well, I agree with the Chief Justice and others who said that this is a crisis. And because it's a crisis, the Public Defense Commission must do a lot more to find lawyers immediately for people charged with crime. That means getting rid of arbitrary caseload limits, restrictions, rules, rostering requirements, none of which is constitutionally required. It means accepting help from the judiciary and finding capable lawyers to take cases, rather than resisting that help. And it means allowing the newly created public defender offices, which have shown some promise here in Kennebec County, to handle the volume and the type of cases that need to be handled. The current system has become a disastrous example of the perfect becoming the enemy of the good, you know? Because just a few years ago, we had all the lawyers we needed, but not enough accountability. Now we have a system that's so focused on rules that it has driven away the lawyers. The commission they want tens of millions of dollars more in the budget. But first, the commission must change. Now, my administration spent months carefully developing this budget, a budget to protect the programs that you have embraced and to protect the long-term fiscal health of the state. Ultimately, we took a balanced approach, one that made some investments, that proposed some savings, and that made some targeted revenue increases. To reduce spending, we are proposing changes to programs primarily within the Department of Health and Human Services. Listen, those decisions have not been easy to make. Believe me when I say that despite having invested more than $56 million just in child care, I do not like having to reduce the stipends that were doubled just last year. Despite having invested more than $500 million into improving main care rates, I do not like having to suspend upcoming cost of living increases for health care providers. Despite expanding pre-K options all across the state, I do not like having to propose scaling back the increases in state funding for Head Start. Despite having stood up shelters and provided other subsidies, tax credits, and loan programs for housing, I don't relish the idea of scaling back the general assistance payments that go to housing. Despite having increased the pension deduction for retirees threefold in 3 years, I don't like having to modify it for anyone, even if only for higher income retirees. But we did not set out to achieve savings in a careless way. Instead, we've tried to be purposeful. Wherever possible, I've proposed amending programs that have not yet been implemented so to make these changes less disruptive. Or I've proposed scaling back programs that have become more expansive in recent years. Or scaling back state dollars where federal dollars are available. All these are worthwhile investments I wish we could continue at higher levels, but we simply cannot sustain all of them. Now, just as I don't like proposing cuts to programs, I also don't like proposing revenue increases, even targeted ones. But if I had to consider a revenue increase, I decided that I wanted it to be specific and purposeful rather than broad-based. And I wanted it to provide some social benefit in return. That's what the cigarette tax achieves. You know, Maine has the highest adult smoking rate and the second highest youth smoking rate in New England. We also have the cheapest cigarettes of nearly every state in New England, and we haven't raised the cigarette excise tax in 2 decades, unlike every other New England state. When cigarettes are a leading cause of cancer, heart disease, and stroke, and when more than 1/3 of Maine cancer deaths each year are caused by smoking, our current policy just doesn't make sense. Recognizing that a higher cost to cigarettes can dissuade some people from smoking, especially young people, my budget proposes a $1 increase to the cigarette excise tax. A $1 increase for a total of $3, which puts us in the middle of our New England neighbors, which is still relatively low. Now, I've heard some of my Republican friends criticize this proposal. Republicans oppose all tax increases. I heard some folks huff and puff, no pun intended. Well, remember how earlier I said that Republican-led Nebraska is facing their own budget problems? Well, their Republican governor, like your Democratic governor, has proposed an increase in their cigarette tax too. So not all Republicans oppose an increase in cigarette taxes, just to be clear. And look, I understand your concern about the impact on low-income people, and that really you would like to make it as cheap as possible for people to smoke. If that's the case, I would simply ask in return that you also not try to cut the very health care services that those same folks are going to need due to smoking. Because that's what you do when you look at cutting Medicaid. You should also know smoking-related medical care costs the Maine Care program more than $281 million a year. And that smoking also reduces productivity in the workforce, absenteeism, and an inability to work, which causes an estimated $1.5 billion loss to our state's economy every year. That's something. That's taxpayer money that could be saved and productivity that would certainly add value to our economy. Well, you know, on another subject, 2016, Maine voters legalized adult use cannabis by referendum. Despite that, the program was not implemented until I took office. And since retail sales began in 2020, Maine's cannabis market has changed a lot. It's time to change our cannabis taxes, too. That's why I'm proposing to lower the excise tax and increase the sales tax, adjustments that will put Maine in the middle of the pack among states for cannabis taxes. And while we're talking about cannabis, I want to say the time has come to better regulate the medical market with testing and tracking requirements so that those consumers, just like the recreational users, can be confident that those products are safe. If you're ingesting cannabis for medical reasons, you ought to want to know that you're not consuming pesticides or other contaminants that are going to make your health worse. We cannot continue to encourage the wild, wild west of medical cannabis, which is contributing also to the illicit market that has emerged and that needs to be fought across rural Maine. My budget also proposes an assessment on non-municipal ambulance and on pharmacy prescriptions. Now, I know you're apprehensive when you hear the words ambulance, pharmacy, and assessment in the same sentence, but let me explain. First, it's important to note that these are not charges that ought to be assessed or passed along to consumers. Here's why. Creating this new stream of revenue will allow us to draw down additional federal funds along with it. We take that new federal funding, turn around, and invest much of it back into higher reimbursement rates for both those ambulances and pharmacies, so they're basically made whole for that cost to begin with. These targeted increases, I think, all told, are reasonable. They raise revenues while leaving the wallets of most Maine families untouched. Look, I have to say, it's not been fun or easy to put this budget together. Something you're beginning to understand, I hope. And again, over all of this is the unpredictability of the federal government, whose actions may directly affect our state appropriations and expenditures and the welfare of Maine people. When I introduced my budget 2 weeks ago, I could hear the collective groans of both Democrats and Republicans echoing in the chambers upstairs. Oh, yes. This is the same pain and frustration my commissioners and I have felt over the past several months as we put this budget together. I know there's a strong desire among some of you to just, quote, tax the rich or, quote, end corporate welfare. I hear you. But I have opposed changing our tax rates, much to the dismay of some of my Democratic friends, because stability and predictability for our people and for entrepreneurs and investors looking at Maine cannot be overstated. Changing our income or sales taxes in order to raise revenue would discourage investments we very much need to keep our economy on track. Investors are looking for a stable fiscal climate, and they in turn will bring high-paying jobs, raising the standard of living, and growing our economy. In the long run, that's the best way to expand our economy, support all of our people, raising revenues consistently. In that same vein, when you say corporate welfare, what I hear you say is you want to do away with incentives that attract technology, manufacturing, or life sciences, for instance, the wave of the future and the producers of future jobs. Well, that too would be short-sighted. To raise broad-based taxes and to cut economic development tools are not winning strategies. Look, to my Democratic friends, I know you don't want to see programs cut. I know many of you would prefer to see us raise more money through tax increases to avoid any reductions whatsoever. But you also know your Republican colleagues on the other side of the aisle don't want to do that, do you? Okay. And to my Republican friends, some of you say you don't want to raise any revenues, even in a targeted way. I know you'd prefer to cut more programs and to bridge the gap, and avoid any and all tax increases. But you also know your Democratic colleagues on the other side of the aisle generally don't want to do that, do you? No. Thank you. So where do we go from here? I've put forward a budget that does not rely entirely on either revenue increases or cuts to programs. Instead, it does both to bridge the gap and continue to invest in things we all support: education, revenue sharing, public safety, higher ed, school meals. Now, I've already heard some of you criticizing the budget before it was even printed. No tax increases, some said. No program cuts, others said. It's easy to stand in front of a TV camera and say no. It's easy to fire off a social media post and feel the good as the likes roll in. But I encourage you to reserve judgment and not create barriers to compromise. Look, I mean, even Old Orchard Beach isn't big enough for all the lines in the sand some of you have already drawn. But it's so much harder to do the work of sitting around the table or the horseshoe, putting forward your own ideas and your constituents' ideas, hearing what folks on all sides have to say, and then coming to consensus to enact balanced public policy. Whether you're a Democrat, Republican, or Independent, that's how I hope you approach these conversations. In good faith, with good ideas, with civility, with an open mind, and ultimately with a commitment and courage to make hard choices. Tonight, I've shared with you a clear account of where the budget stands, so that our discussions may commence with a common understanding of the challenges we face. While it's true we have some tough decisions to make in the coming weeks, we also shouldn't lose sight of the strengths of our state and the strengths of our people. I mean, what other place is home to people who can make a living off the unpredictable and uncontrollable elements of life as we do? The fishermen who greet the ebb and flow of the tides, farmers who meet the rise and fall of the seasons, loggers and mill workers who remake the bounty of our forests. What other place is home to scenic downtowns, award-winning food and drink, and vibrant small businesses, thought-provoking art, literature, and music that move the soul, pristine beaches, granite coves, and breathtaking fields and mountains, always within reach? What other places produce stars like Cooper Flagg and his talented brothers from Newport, Maine? I'm sure Ken Fredette knows them. Who doesn't love Cooper? Yeah. Go Duke. These young guys, Cooper and his brothers, like they make all of life's achievements seem like a slam dunk. I love them. or singers like Julia Gagnon, who capture the charm and spirit of our state with her beautiful voice. Clean air, clean water, good schools, yes, safe streets, healthy forests and farms, clear lakes and fish-filled rivers, sturdy waterfronts. A strong economy with rewarding jobs in a state that people want to visit in every season. We know these aren't little things, my friends. We're lucky. We have them all. Let's use this session to protect those things that make us special and keep our state on a stable fiscal course. When we hear anger and acrimony, we should stop and remember the words of our dear friend Dave Mallet, who told us that things, especially things in Maine, are better than that. You know, it's this time of year that the early morning sun confronts the face of the Capitol, breaking through the east-facing facade, crowning it with light. It makes me feel hopeful when I see it, hopeful about the progress of the day and the course of the year. I see faces and I hear voices across every county, town, and city, every corner of the state, all looking to us to manage the finances of the state, to work with civil purpose, to solve problems, to create hope and prosperity, to keep people safe, and to preserve that which makes our state so special. We've demonstrated in the past that Democrats, Republicans, and Independents can put their heads together, and we can get good results. I'm ready to work with you in the coming months on a budget that is balanced, that is fiscally responsible, that strengthens our economy, and that lifts up our greatest asset of all, the people of Maine. Thank you, and God bless the state of Maine.
You've been watching live coverage of Governor Janet Mills addressing the legislature and the state with her proposed $11.6 billion budget proposal, which would cover the next 2 years. As she just finished up speaking now, we do want to remind you that there is a Republican response coming that is said to be coming momentarily. We, of course, will stay with this coverage while we wait for that to happen.
We have an idea of what Republicans are probably going to say in their response. We heard from the House Minority Leader, Republican Billy Bob Falkingham, earlier today, and he said things like this budget was absurd, this proposal absurd, and that it taxes the poor people of Maine. So again, we are looking forward to hearing more from Republicans on their response, but overall, her address to everyone has been fairly bipartisan.
We are told the Republican response is coming momentarily. We'll listen in.
I'm Senator Trey Stewart from Aroostook County, and I have the honor of serving as the Republican leader in the Maine Senate. Let me be crystal clear. This budget is the worst in decades. The governor has lied to us all in her promises to not raise taxes on Maine people. She's proposing a dozen new taxes, including a tax on retirees and a 70-cent tax on every prescription filled in Maine. Let me be clear about one more thing. This budget has 0 Republican votes. We know that Maine is already one of the highest tax states in the country, and Mainers are already struggling to scrape by. This budget throws gas on that fire. Unfortunately, it seems my Democrat colleagues are hell-bent on purporting to be firefighters when they're really the arsonists here. We know you're smart enough to figure that out, though. These proposed tax increases are an insult to the people of Maine, people who have to learn to live within their means, while their government refuses to do the same. People who continue to give and give, only to see the fruits of their labor taken away. It doesn't have to be this way. And Republicans are here not only to ring the alarm, as we have for years, but to offer pathways to unleashing the potential of Mainers to improve their own station. First, let's talk about energy. We believe in a system that prioritizes Maine's people and not out-of-state solar developers and Wall Street hedge funds. We'll fight this session to end the subsidies that you're paying for each month in your light bill that fund unsightly and inefficient solar fields. You should tell our Democrat counterparts to follow our lead on this if you're as mad about this scheme as we are. Next, let's talk about taxes. We don't think your property taxes should go up because some out-of-stater overpaid for your neighbor's house to become their third vacation home. Maine property taxes should be about providing local services that are necessary for our communities to function. We'll be introducing a new model this year to fund these services differently and limit the tax burden on our most vulnerable seniors. We will work with anyone, regardless of party, to provide stability and predictability in our property taxes. Along those lines, the biggest item in local budgets is typically the public school system. While Democrats have thrown more money at public schools, scores have plummeted to some of the worst in the nation. We should be empowering teachers to teach and kids to learn. By getting back to the basics and common sense in the classroom, we'll see our performance improve. Finally, much of our budget woes are due to Maine being a welfare state. Thousands of people came to Maine to access our far too generous welfare system, costing us millions of dollars in cost overruns. We should have a welfare system that acts as a safety net, not a hammock for the lazy to hang out in without limit. Getting people back to work and injecting accountability into this system is one of our primary focuses this session. I encourage you to pressure our Democrat colleagues to join us. While the budget gap was created by Democrats, we're happy to help them fix it. We can and must do better and are relying on you contacting your legislators to ensure that they put partisanship aside and do the right thing right now. I've lived in Maine all 30 years of my life and have come to believe some basic things about our state. Mainers are smart, resilient, and industrious. We want what is best for our state and will work to make it happen. If we continue to fight on, we will win. And the next 30 years will be the best yet. I truly believe that our best days are ahead of us, and by charting a new course, we can turn our dreams into a reality that will benefit every Mainer, from Kittery to Fort Kent and every small town in between.
Good evening. I'm Representative Billy Bob Fockingham, the leader of the House Republicans in the Maine legislature. Democrats created this budget mess. They turned record tax revenues into a deficit. Instead of lowering taxes, Democrats continued to recklessly spend your hard-earned tax dollars. They abandoned the traditional bipartisan budget process by passing budgets without Republican support. Their irresponsible spending led to this shortfall. Governor Mills says she doesn't believe that the government can or should be all things to all people all of the time. But what this budget says is that she will tax all things and all people all of the time. Instead of addressing what caused the deficit by reducing spending, the governor is proposing to spend $1.1 billion more by taxing Maine's poorest citizens, low-income workers, senior citizens, and people living on fixed income. This is on top of the $448 million payroll tax that just took effect January 1st. How much pain can they inflict on you, the Maine people, before you say, enough is enough? Maine has the third highest tax burden in the country. Our property taxes are the highest in the nation. Rather than tax everything and everyone, Democrats should do what everyday working families do when they have less money: spend less. The governor boasts about a 55% education funding and continued revenue sharing in her budget, but these are things we can easily agree on. This budget seems like it was written by a millionaire out of touch with reality. Taxes on paint cans, digital streaming, prescription drugs, cannabis, tobacco products, retiree pensions, and even an ambulance tax are taxes on the poor and middle class. This tax and spend mentality is threatening our children's future. Republicans are united in opposing new taxes on Maine's poor, our middle class, our workers, our families, our businesses, and our seniors. Good night and God bless.
All right, an unusual double Republican response there to the governor's State of the Budget address. We heard from Senator Trey Stewart of Aroostook County and Representative Billy Bob Fockingham there, really drawing the clear divide, I think, which the governor also addressed of more taxes versus cutting services in her address, which we also just heard about, just about an hour of the governor speaking, which seemed like a blend of a state of the state and a state of the budget, touching a few issues.
It did, and one of the things that stood out in her conclusion was, I encourage you to reserve judgment and not create barriers to compromise. So even she hoping that both Republicans and Democrats can come together this session and try to figure things out.
Make the numbers work.
Thanks so much for being with us for our special coverage of the governor's State of the Budget. We'll have much more, including reaction from members of the legislature and from our political analysts, coming up tonight at 11.
Thanks for being with us. Have a great night.